Hello and welcome to the making of The Thing from Marvel's Fantastic Four. Join me as I walk you through how I created this model using various industry standard 3D software packages. This video is broken up into various chapters where I share with you my knowledge and hopefully give you some tips on how to improve your own works. So, grab a drink and let's get started. Inside of ZBrush, I start off with the primitive shapes tools to block out the forms of my model, and using the move brush I just bend and twist and move those primitive shapes so that they're not so blocky and give more of an organic look to the model at the beginning stage. Once I'm happy with the overall shapes, I then start dynameshing and merging the primitives together, and then using the clay buildup brush and the move tool and the smooth tool, I then start to sculpt the anatomy of my character. I wanted to keep the anatomy as close to real as possible, with hints of, superhero, super creature style to it. But the overall shape of the model needed to have a very anatomically correct feel to it. So I used references from the Hulk from the Marvel film and Thanos to get that sort of shape correct, because those look and work really well together. I also gave him 3 fingers rather than 5, as if it was from the comic books itself, because in the comic books he only has 3 digits on his hand and a thumb. This stage I'm just working on the face, where I block in the shapes, again just using move, clay buildup, and the smooth brush. The smooth brush less often than you should use it, because I feel that you can get away with not having to use the smooth brush too often, especially at this early stages. You want to keep those forms, even if it's a mistake, it could work pretty well later on. So now I'm just developing the face further, trying to find a character inside the sculpt. It will come out later on. Right now it's just trying to get something down as fast as possible, and then work around the whole model instead of working in just one area for too long. And right now I am just working on the feet, on the toes, again using the same logic as the hands. I'm giving this a bit of an artistic license where he has 3 toes rather than 5. It was just something I thought up, which turned out to work pretty well later on, as you'll see. So if you find it difficult to sculpt anatomy, I know a lot of people do. Even I'm not great at sculpting anatomy, especially when it comes to realistic humans. There is a book called The Anatomy for 3D Artists, the Essential Guide for CG Professionals, and I highly recommend you go out and buy that book. Even if you're not a beginner, it's still a very good book to have next to you all the time, to make sure that you get the anatomy correctly. It shows you very detailed images of anatomy, and you can see where the bones and the muscles are and all that sort of thing. It is really helpful, especially for beginners to use. So it's at this point that I'm happy with the blockout of my character, and we're coming to the end of the first stage, and yeah, it's looking a little bit more organic than the primitives that I started off with, and that was the whole goal of the blockout stage, was to just block out the anatomy correctly before going in with a more detailed sculpting, which will be coming in the next few chapters. I added the heavier brow to the character. It gave it a bit more of the thing look, and even if the model doesn't look great at the moment, it will fix itself later once we start sculpting those details. So see you in the next chapter. It's at this point that I've finished the blockout stage and I've moved into the sculpting stage, where I've taken my model further and started filling out the model a bit more, adding those more defined forms for the anatomy as well. I'm also still using the move brush, the clay build-up brush, and the smooth brush. I've also introduced the standard brush, which I use to cut into the model and bring those forms out a bit more, and those anatomical shapes. At this point, I'm still very much using references. I've now started to incorporate asymmetry to my model, especially in the middle section of the character, using the clay brush now to get more of a softer build up around those areas, and those that will help to define landmarks, sort of rock formations later on when we come to detailing them. In the left hand side, you'll see some references that I use to refer back to when I'm sculpting my character. And now I'm using the standard brush to cut into the model. Everything on the left and right hand side, the arms and the legs, are symmetrical, as well as the face at some extent, but I try to keep the middle section as asymmetrical as possible. Thus it helps sell that it's a rocky formation of a monster or creature, and it's not all symmetrically perfect. Now just using the clay 2 constant brush, just to make some more plateaus in the rock formations and the details, using the add and subtract to break up and make some hard edges. It's still very much just the sculpting stage for now. I haven't moved into any detailing whatsoever, but it is coming together a lot more. So just using a few of the basic brushes from ZBrush, I am just working the character very much, still very loose, defining the shapes, breaking up symmetry, cutting into the model just to help me later on build those shapes up a bit more, as well as those shapes not being lost in the future when I come to detailing. It's just getting everything ready basically for the detailing stage. Now I'm just working on the back of a character, adding some cut lines in. As you can see now, there's a lot more cuts, just finding those muscle areas which will eventually become rock formations, but it's nice to cut it up and have those areas visible. Now moving on, I start creating the costume for my character using the simple extraction tool. Then I polish in the deformation. I use a polish tool to clean up the edges of the model, and then using ZRemesh, I ZRemesh the model many times to get clean topology to work from. After this, I use the cut tool to cut in the model and define panels, which will become stitch lines for my costume, and it will break it up into different sections of the costume. So I'm doing that now, just cutting it up. I wanted to go more traditional, the costume. I didn't want to have space age stuff or outlandish costumes. I wanted to keep it more original to the comic book, but at the same time with a flair of, you know, design to it. So this is the pants, and then I use an extraction method to get those loops, the panel loops, sorry, to get those those panels separated from each other with a stitching around it. Now I'm just adjusting the pants a bit more, making sure that it's hugging the body as much as possible. And just working with the clay build-up in a very low res pants, I'm just adding detail, and then later on using dam standard and the standard brush, I just cut in some wrinkles where fold lines would be, just to give it a bit more shape and design. Now the emblem of the Fantastic Four, which I'm creating now, was on the right hand side of his body for quite a while, but then I decided later on to create a belt around his waist and put the emblem in the middle of the pants instead, like the original comic books would have, or do have. Now I'm just redesigning the pants in this section. Sometimes they don't always come out the way you want it the first time, and then you go back and you update it, and you create another model. Just the way things are. You can't always rely on the first model that you create. So this is the second costume that I created with a bit more thought going into how the pants would actually have stitch lines and stuff like that, and then of course adding the standard, using standard brush and dam standard, just add those folds back in and get it to the same stage it was before. So after the costume has been created, I look back at the model and I start detailing further the head and making sure that's ready for further detailing in the next chapter. Blocking out more rocky formations very quickly, making sure the anatomy is working correctly, the character's the right height, the shapes all work well, and everything is ready for the detail pass. There's going to be quite a few detail passes in this character, but the first one will be the next chapter. Now just adding some more lines and plateaus to the model, rocky formations, cutting it up where need be. Working some of that detail into the legs as well. But we're coming up to the end of this chapter now. We'll be moving into ZBrush Part 3 detailing, where we'll look at more of the detailing section. So join me in the next chapter. We're finally in the ZBrush detailing stage, where I go around the whole model with the dam standard brush and start cutting in rock formations and detailing the character and making sure that the details make sense. So where there are bigger rocks on the bigger formations and smaller rocks where there will be a lot more movement, just remembering that we have to think about this as a realistic character that would work in the real world. So we need to keep that in mind when modeling our rocks formations. Just working through the whole body, asymmetry on the middle, cutting it up, making it look rock-like with different brushes. And the references, I start putting in references of real rocks just to have as a backup to my thing concepts from the internet. And yeah, it's basically just me going through the whole model and detailing it even further. I will sometimes change the material inside a ZBrush because your eyes can get quite used to the material and you won't see the details a lot. So sometimes it's best to change the material every now and then so that you have fresh eyes on it. Also take a few minutes away from the concept and come back to it with fresh eyes. But at this point I'm still cutting into it and creating rock shapes using the clay tubes constant brush, add and subtract to get those hard edges and plateaus. And I'll go through every single rock. That's the only way you'll be able to have a very unique looking character, is if you go through it every single rock individually and sculpt those details in by hand. There are alphas you can use, of course, to get rock-like textures, but it doesn't beat physically sculpting in that detail. It's something that you get out of that you wouldn't get out of realistic, or not even sometimes realistic, just alphas that are created to look like rock shapes. It'd be all good and well for environmental models, but not for a character. And just working around the face again, putting a bit of asymmetry in it, back around the shoulders, working some more detail into those shoulder areas, because I noted that when the movement happens, shoulders will rotate and move. So you don't want big rocks there, you want smaller rocks to mimic movement and wrinkling. Just detailing the hands with the damn standard. A lot of damn standard brush use at the stage. Just bear in mind that this is the high poly model in Dynamesh still, and what we're going to do is we're going to take this into Maya and retopo it, bring it back in, and project all this detail that we've created inside of ZBrush onto our Maya clean model. So we can't go too far with the detailing. We can go to a certain point, then we need to retopo, get clean topology, bring it back, and then reproject all this detail back on, and then detail further. So join me in Maya, where I'll be taking this model, the high-res model, into Retopo using basic tools, and then UV mapping and bringing it back into ZBrush for further detailing. So at this stage, I have taken the high poly model from ZBrush and moved it into Maya, where I start to retopo it using Maya's retopoing tools. I wanted to make it correct topology, so that would divide nicely and have the correct edge flow. I'm not going to go through how edge flow is created for characters, but there are plenty of tutorials out there describing or talking you through how to create good edge flow for your characters. I always tend to start off with the head because it has so many different it has so many polygons in it that it's good to start off in that area, general area, and then move my way down the body, working on the torso and then the arms. I have it in symmetry mode at the moment because the model is pretty symmetrical, which helps us out really. So if this was a character with asymmetry, it would take a little longer to do and be a little bit more painful to get the model right, but because we've modeled ours symmetrical to a point, we can just go ahead and retopo it with symmetry turned on. I'm just working around the whole model, adding the legs now. What I like to do, instead of building each square or quad individually, what I'll do is I'll wrap the quads around the leg and then extrude all the way down to the ankle. I think you'll see that in a minute. Extrude it all the way down to the ankle like that, and then add edge loops between. And because the high poly model is live, the topology will stick to that character or to that model when you add edge loops. Just taking a break and having a look at the model. So you can see I'm now attaching the head to the neck. And then I'll clean up those triangles. I wanted to keep it as close to quads as possible. Because video games and film characters tend to work best with quads models rather than triangles or five-sided shapes. I'm working around the arm. Again, the same method. Build a loop around the shoulder and then just drag that all the way down to the wrist and then add edge loops. This is a very quick way of creating low poly characters without having to go into too much detail. You're building the shell of the character in a very low res version. So now I'm just using the same technique for the fingers as I did for the arms and the legs. Just extruding out, making this as quick as possible. You can spend ages retopoing a character. Once you get used to it, you'll start to make a character quickly, because you'll know about anatomy flow or topology flow for anatomy. Now I'm just finishing off the eyes of our character, the eye holes for our character. Just closing those up. Now I didn't make a mouth in a mouth bag for the character because it is never going to be animated, so it doesn't need to have a mouth. But initially you would do that if you were creating a game character or a film character. You would build the inside of the mouth with the tongue and the teeth and the gums, but for this model I just kept his mouth closed. Moving on to the eyeballs now. I am creating a film type eyeball, something that you would use in film and some AAA video games. The first part would be the sclera, which is the reflective surface, and then I would build the iris, which sits inside. It's more of a donut shape with a hole in the middle, and then the last piece would be the pupil, which sits just behind the iris, which will be completely black. Now I'm just fixing up the geometry, making sure it all works fine. Pushing it into the head of my character. And the last part will be the retopoing of the costume. Again, you want to start off with very big shapes to retopo it. And then when it comes to getting higher resolution, we'll just divide it inside of ZBrush instead of dividing it inside of Maya. This should bring us to the end of this chapter. It was a very quick chapter, just wanted to show you the techniques I use inside of Maya to get good topology, and then we will move on to the UV mapping. So I'll see you in the next chapter. So still inside of Maya, we're now working on the UV mapping of our character. I'm not going to go into too much detail, this is going to be quite a short chapter, but I essentially am going to create the UVs so that it's fit for a film character rather than a game character. There's a difference between the two. For the games characters, you will have a limited amount of UVs, sort of tiles that you could use for the game, whereas film, you don't really have a limit on the amount of tiles. I've worked on characters that have had 100 UDIMs, but we're not going to need 100 UDIMs for this character. At the moment, I'm just cutting up the model where the seams are, trying to hide the seams in certain areas so it's not visible. Now, that's more important, I guess, for game characters. You want to hide the seams, but for film characters, I've never really had that much of an issue with the seams. That's probably because we use a lot of projection maps rather than hand-painted ones, so just bear that in mind. For game characters, you want to hide the seams. For film characters, not so much, unless they're really visible. So at this point, I am laying out the UVs, unfolding them, and then what I do is I delete one half of the model, and then I unwrap that one half of the model. This comes in handy later on because we have a symmetrical character, so we just have to mirror over once we're done, and we have the other side with the UVs. It keeps the UVs symmetrical, which is great for game characters. So you can see now I have one side created, and I am now laying out the model and cutting that up even further so that I can get more detail from those pieces when it comes to texturing. So I'm just now laying out. This is typically how you would lay out a film character. So I'm just cutting the model up now even further. The more you cut it, the more detail you can get in those sections that you've cut. I've also added the checker flag onto the checker flag texture onto the model so that I can see how it's going to look, and all the squares are the same. Now I am going to mirror over, and then inside the UV layout, I'm just going to push the left hand side above the others so that each one has their own separate UDIM, and that's typically how you would do it in film. And just going to finish it off with the pants now. Do the same thing, mirror over, and then move it into place. We're now coming to the end of this very quick chapter. I just wanted to show you the UV system or the UV layout that I created for this model. In the next chapter, we'll take the low-res model into ZBrush and we'll start projecting that high detail back onto our low-res model and then add more detail to our model before taking it further into texturing. So I'll see you in the next chapter. We are now back inside of ZBrush, where I have imported the low-res model with the UV maps, and I am now going to project all that detail from the high poly onto the low poly. I tend to go from a low level subdivision and gradually project upwards throughout the levels. I don't tend to go straight to the highest level subdivision and then project, because you get a lot of artifacting. And this is me just cleaning up some of those artifacts that come from projecting from the high res to the low res. And now we are at the moment 3 to 4 million polygons, whereas the high poly model that we created from the Dynamesh was 2 million. So we have 2 extra million to play with, and I'm now going in and adding those details to my model, which I couldn't add before I retopoed. Just working around the mouth area at the moment. And essentially I will just go around the whole model and just clean it up, make it ready for texturing. So at the end of this video, or this chapter, I would have exported a high-res model and a low-res model for my texturing. So the low-res model would sit at around 300,000 or 150,000 polygons, which is typical for your film sort of character, like a LOD 300 type character. Not so typical for games characters. I think that would be way too much. That would probably crash the game you're trying to make. But for film characters, it's definitely fine. And then I'll take them both into Substance Painter, which is the program I'm going to use, and I will project the high poly detail onto the low poly, and then start texturing the model. This has just been a very quick chapter. Once again, not much to say really. If you've done projecting and detailing before, then this has just come naturally to you. Just making some sharp edges on the rocks now, rock surfaces, using the trim dynamic. It's about ready to take into Substance to start texturing. So I'll leave it there now, and I'll pick this back up in the next chapter inside of Substance. So inside Substance, I load in my low poly character and prepare it for texturing. I have to bake the maps from the high poly to the low poly. So I'm just going to bake them all in now. And it's going to take a while because there's so many UDIMs for this character. Normally for game characters it would take no time at all. But for film characters it will take a little longer to do. But each of those islands that you see there being baked are going to be 4K textures, so they're going to be quite large textures, and that's your typical texturing when it comes to film characters, 4K, 8K area. So now I'm just going to start adding layers inside of Substance. I tend to use filled layers a lot rather than paint layers, because with filled layers you can control it a lot better. You don't have to worry about it being destructive. When you use a paint layer and you physically paint the model, you're going to find that it's going to be a destructive means of working, because you will have to at some point go back into your Substance scene or your texturing scene and redo some textures, and if it's painted directly onto the model, it's going to be very difficult to change that. So I tend to use a lot of filled layers with masks rather. That way I have more control over how the textures work on the model. And now I've added some procedural textures. Textures are found on the internet and I've made them tileable. So I'm just adding these to the model. As you can see, it's giving it that realistic rock texture look to the color. And it's all about making the surface look like rock now. I'm just going around using references from my Pure Ref to figure out the color. I wanted to keep it sort of comic book accurate as well as realistic, so it couldn't be bright orange, but if it was more of a dull sandy color it would work better. Just painting in some of those dark areas around the eyes, just to emphasize them a lot further, make them more of a focal point. Now I'm just trying to get some variation with the colors of the rocks, so they're not all the same color. So some of them are going to be darker, some of them are going to be lighter. Now moving on to the costume, where I'll put a base texture down, synthetic fabric. This gives me the roughness values for this costume piece, which saves me time trying to find the roughness of costume, and then I'll just start adding new colors on top of that and fabrics, defining which is fabric and which is more of like a rubber texture for the seams and the clothing. And now just finishing off the logo of our character, and that should be texturing done. I say should be done, but I found that I had to revisit Substance later on to fix the textures, and you'll be doing this a lot as well. You will go through multiple passes on the textures before you get the texture right. That's all done because of the look dev section, which will be coming up soon. You'll find that the textures don't work, or they're too dark, or whichever, but you'll have to come back in at some point and fix textures or change textures. We'll be moving into the rendering section next, in the next chapter, which is coming up soon, so stay tuned for that. We'll be using Arnold Renderer inside of Maya, and I'll show you how I set up the materials for my model. So join me in the next chapter, where we'll be looking at the rendering. So, back inside of Maya, I am now creating the scene for the rendering. I added a floor and a sky dome, and a HDMI for the sky dome. And I'm now just testing the model. Then creating a AI standard surface shader and plugging in my ZBrush texture into the displacement maps and testing those inside of Maya. Always quite tricky to get the ZBrush correct. It takes a little time to figure out how to do things correctly. So now I'm just adding a color map, diffuse map, and each one will go through a color correction node inside of the shader, so that I can tweak the color or the values of that texture further. There's only so much you can do inside of the texturing stage, but the look dev stage, you will always have to use the maps that are given to you and tweak them inside of the rendering. So now I'm just testing some more out. I saw that the color map was coming in way too red, so I added a hue saturation change to the color and made it a bit more orange. Now I'm just adding a 3-point light system. So that's a rim, a fill, and a point light. Just setting up the scene further. So that's the material for the body. And now I'm just playing around with that height displacement from ZBrush, making sure it's working correctly. Moving on, just playing around inside the look dev. This is what you would call look dev, and now I'm adding in the logo textures, and again adding a color correct between the files, so that I can correct them as I go inside of the look dev stage. Just gonna test out render. And now for the costume, same thing, plug in the maps and hit render and see how it looks. And if need be, to adjust it inside the color correction node that I connected. So the roughness will be color corrected later on, as well as the color. So once I got all the textures onto my model, I started having a look around the model, and I saw that the rock textures, the displacement maps, weren't strong enough. So I decided to take the model back into ZBrush and do another detail pass to really bulk out those rock formations on my character. Which will be in the next chapter, actually. So you'll get to see me use brushes to define those shapes even further, because at the moment he looks a bit too round and blobby. Reminds me of the first Fantastic Four, The Thing, with the guy in the suit, which wasn't amazingly great. So I want to pull away from that idea and make my model a bit sharper. So at the moment I'm still testing and plugging away and retexturing the pants inside of Substance outside of the video. You could spend weeks doing tests and renders trying to get it just right. I eventually add the textures to the eyes as well, but I think I did that off screen as well. I am not exactly the best look dev artist either. I am definitely more of a ZBrush artist, so I apologize if I've got any of my terminology wrong. Right now I'm just testing the renders again, and I'm still looking around the whole model, and you can see that it's quite flat, so I'm going to have to take this into ZBrush again and detail it even further. So stay tuned for the next chapter, where we'll take our model back into ZBrush and define more of those rock shapes. we are back inside of ZBrush, detailing those rock formations further, since we found out that they were quite flat in the rendering, and so we need to bulk these forms out in the ZDisk so that we can get sharper rocks and more of a silhouette rather than just a roundish blob. So using Trim Dynamic, Trim Adaptive, the Dam Standard, Clay Buildup brush, I start to sculpt out the details of the rocks further, adding more definition to them as well. And I go through every single rock on the body and the arms and the legs and make sure that every single one has had at least some sort of sculpting change to them. So yeah, that took quite a while. It took a long time to go through each and every one and make sure to make it look hard surface. I started looking at more references from movies. So the latest Fantastic Four, which had a fully CG rock monster in it, I started looking at how that worked, as well as multiple other references and actual rock references on how they look and how they work together to get these shapes working. So I'll leave it there for now, and I'll catch up in a minute to go through what I changed and anything else. As you can see on the right hand side where the layers are, I turn on and off the layers to see how the sculpting is affecting my model and what I had from what I have now. It's always good to use layers in ZBrush, especially if you're working on, let's say, a major film or a game production. Layers are a way of making sure that you don't destroy your model with the sculpting, because it's one thing if you have to undo 200 sculpts. That's another thing if you can just turn off a layer or delete a layer or tone down a layer as well. So just keep that in mind. Layers are your friends, and you should get used to using them inside of ZBrush because they will help you in the future. So now I'm moving down to the legs, and I'm really going into town with them, sculpting and cutting into the model, just trying to make some sort of hard surface rock like formations for the legs. And I think they turned out pretty well in the final render once you see it, and the design of them as well, that they just really work well. I think it would have been a shame to put shoes on him like they did in the first film. I think that was a big mistake. I think you'd never find shoes big enough for this guy, so it was the best idea to leave them off in the latest film. And I decided that I would do just that. I was just gonna leave shoes off on my model. So we are coming to the end of this section. It's a long section. It was even longer to sculpt on my side. So what I will do after this is just bake out the ZBrush maps again, and then plug them into the model inside of Maya. Stay tuned for the next chapter, which will be me rigging my model, preparing it for the pose and the final render. This is going to be a quick chapter on how I rigged my character. I used the lowest LOD, or lowest subdivision level of my character, the one that I created in the retopology, to bind a rig to my character. It's a good way to skin very low res character instead of having to skin a full res character, because you get a lot of skin weighting issues. So I decided to do just that. I built a basic rig inside of Maya. I'm not the greatest rigging artist. I know enough to get me by, but I wouldn't know how to create controls or anything like that. This model won't have controls for it. It's purely just rigging it so that I can pose him in a cool pose and then render him. But it can be controls can be created for this model if I take it into more in depth in the future, or someone wants to rig it and animate it. But just bear in mind there is no mouth for this character, so you won't be able to open his mouth. It would just be static pose, walking animations and stuff like that. So once I've did my skeleton, I created eye controls, which took me a while to do because I couldn't remember how to do them properly. So I went through like 3 hours trying to rig these eyes, and at the end I just decided to constrain them to the bones, and rotate them on a locator. So that was the end game for me on the eyes. I didn't want to spend too much time in rigging, so I just left it as it was. I then moved on to skinning the character using skin weights tools, binding the skin, and then animating the joints so that I can skin weight him. If you haven't done skin weights before, then you probably wouldn't know what I was talking about, but this is just basic skin weighting. nothing special. There's not much I can say about rigging, to be fair. I don't know the ins and outs. I know enough to get by, but I predominantly do the texturing and modeling side of things. But this is the best way to get a model nicely posed, rather than using ZBrush transpose tools to do it. You can do it in ZBrush, but I find this is much better results than using ZBrush's transpose tools. If you have the time, obviously. If you don't have the time, then you're better off just doing it in ZBrush. So we're coming to the end of this chapter. It was quite a short chapter. Just wanted to show you some of the skinning and rigging that I did for this model. But we'll be going through to the posing stage next, and I think I'll just leave the time-lapse video up to play whilst you watch. I won't talk too much. I'll talk a little bit at the beginning about what was going on and or how the scene set up and stuff, but I won't go on too much. So let's reconvene in the next chapter, and I'll see you there. So once I got the skinning done, I applied it to my high-res model. I then built a scene around my character, just to give it a bit more gravitas, or just to give it a more interesting look to it. And I started to pose my model. I was going for a powerful pose. I didn't want him to look like a monster. I don't want him to look like he was scary. I wanted him to be more powerful and strong, and have the pose reflect that. So I chose a simple pose for my guy, sort of looking into the distance and chest high sort of thing. So yeah, this was me time-lapse posing him, and then after that it's just rendering the final image, and he's all done. So I hope you have enjoyed this walkthrough of how I created the Thing from Fantastic Four, and the methods that I showed you, and my walkthrough or work pipeline for my model. And I hope you have learned something from all this. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.